Picture this. You're a respected Roman senator, one of the most important men in the empire. Your family name goes back many generations. Your toga carries the purple stripe of nobility, and you've spent decades serving Rome with honor. Tonight, you've received a golden invitation to dine with the emperor himself, an honor that should make you proud. But as you climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, your stomach twists with fear. The guards at the door don't meet your eyes. They already know what you're walking into, and their silence says it all. The smell of sweet incense doesn't fully cover something else: fear, heavy and choking in the air. You step into the grand hall where Rome's elite are already gathered: senators, their wives, rich merchants, and military commanders, all standing in stiff silence. Then you hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor, followed by wild laughter that makes your blood run cold. Emperor Caligula enters, wearing silk that glimmers like liquid gold, his eyes burning with strange intensity. He scans the room like a predator studying its prey, then claps his hands with dramatic delight. "My dear friends," he says, his voice booming off the marble walls, "tonight we shall see who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see how far you'll go to prove your loyalty." What follows will break every rule of Roman decency, turning these sacred halls of power into a stage for the emperor's darkest appetites. This is the story of how one man's madness corrupted an entire empire, and how absolute power became absolute corruption. Before we go deeper into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And please, comment below to tell me where you're listening from. I think it's amazing that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different places in the world, connected across time by our curiosity about the past. To understand how the most powerful man in the world turned his palace into a den of intimate depravity and mental torture, you need to see how Caligula became emperor in the first place. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, he got his nickname Caligula, Little Boots, as a child, when he followed his father Germanicus on military campaigns dressed in tiny soldier gear that charmed the legions. But childhood in the imperial family was anything but safe. By the time he was 7, Caligula had watched his father die under mysterious circumstances, likely poison ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He saw his mother, Agrippina the Elder, and his brothers vanish into exile, prison, and death, victims of the deadly paranoia of Roman politics. Imagine being a child and knowing that a knock at the door could mean your end. Caligula learned to survive in a world where weakness meant death, where trust didn't exist. He became a master of pretending, acting harmless while his family was destroyed one by one. This trauma shaped him, feeding his later obsession with dominating and humiliating others, especially those who reminded him of the powers that had once terrorized him. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed Caligula as emperor with real joy. Here was the son of their beloved Germanicus, the boy who once charmed the soldiers. Rome had suffered for years under the paranoid and withdrawn Tiberius. They wanted someone young, someone who promised glory again. For 7 months, Caligula gave them everything they hoped for. He recalled exiles, gave bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and held amazing public games. The people adored him. But then something changed. Something that turned the palace from a place of government into a playground for the emperor's darkest appetites. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell gravely ill with what sources call a brain fever, so severe it nearly stopped the empire. For days he lingered between life and death while Rome prayed for him to recover. Some historians believe this sickness caused permanent brain damage. Others think it simply peeled away the thin layer of sanity that had kept his dark side hidden. When Caligula recovered, those closest to him saw it instantly. The young man who once showed wisdom and restraint was gone. In his place stood someone disconnected from reality. Someone with no boundaries between holy and unholy, acceptable and unthinkable. At first, the public didn't notice. It began small, with overspending, odd behavior in private meetings, and strange decisions. But inside the palace walls, something much darker grew. Caligula had learned something during his near-death experience. He realized that as emperor, he could do anything to anyone, and no one could stop him. Servants who had worked for the imperial family for years suddenly found themselves at the mercy of the emperor's strange whims and sexual demands. Young male slaves were especially at risk. Caligula would call them into his private chambers and force them into acts that broke every idea of Roman honor. But it was the female servants who suffered the most. Ancient sources, written carefully in the polite language of their time, describe how the emperor roamed the palace halls at night, picking women at random to satisfy his desires. These weren't consensual encounters. They were acts of pure control, designed to show that Caligula had absolute power over everyone around him. The emperor's appetites weren't limited to servants. He started inviting the wives of senators and high officials to private meetings, pretending it was to discuss their husbands' careers or family matters. These women, raised with the strict morals of Roman high society, were trapped. Refusing the emperor meant death, not only for them, but for their entire families. One chilling account says Caligula would order these women to strip naked and perform sexual acts while he watched from his throne. Sometimes, he even brought in several women at once, making them compete for his attention. The mental torture was just as sharp as the physical abuse. These proud Roman matrons, once highly respected, were reduced to objects for the emperor's amusement. What made Caligula's palace so horrifying wasn't only the abuse itself, it was how carefully he used sex as a weapon to destroy the Roman social order. He knew that by forcing the empire's most respected families to take part or witness acts of humiliation, he could break their spirits more deeply than any torture. The emperor began holding fancy dinner parties that started like normal social events, but always collapsed into orgies. He invited senators with their wives and daughters, pretending at first it was civilized entertainment. But as the night went on, his demands grew more shocking. "Senator Marcus," Caligula might say, casually, as if asking for more wine, "your wife has such beautiful eyes. I wonder what they look like when she's on her knees before me." The senator would sit in silence, knowing that any protest would mean death for his family. Meanwhile, his wife had no choice but to obey, often in front of her husband and children. The psychological destruction to these families was permanent. Marriages broken, children scarred, and ancient Roman bloodlines turned into nothing more than playthings for the emperor. Caligula enjoyed most of all forcing senators to watch their wives degraded. He arranged seats so husbands had a clear view of their wives being forced into oral sex with him or with men he chose. Their faces, rage, shame, and helplessness gave Caligula as much satisfaction as the acts themselves. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was even remodeled to suit Caligula's growing fantasies. He built special rooms designed just for group encounters, complete with stages and viewing areas. Surviving fragments show rooms where couches were placed in circles, so everything could be seen from every side. One chamber, according to old accounts, was built like a small theater with raised seats around a central floor where Caligula staged sexual performances. He forced captured enemies, slaves, and even Roman citizens to perform, while senators and their families were ordered to watch and applaud. The emperor's bedroom itself became a place of terror. Unlike the private rooms of past emperors, Caligula's chamber had viewing spaces and multiple doors so he could bring in audiences to watch. He seemed to enjoy being watched as much as the acts, turning intimacy into a public display of his absolute rule. The emperor even set up what was basically a brothel inside the palace, staffed by the wives and daughters of senators who had lost his favor. These women were forced to serve not only Caligula, but also his guests, foreign visitors, and sometimes even common soldiers as the ultimate humiliation. The emperor often directed these scenes himself, giving commentary and instructions like a stage director. Perhaps the most shocking thing of all was how Caligula mixed sexual humiliation into Rome's most sacred traditions. Political and religious ceremonies that had been done with dignity for centuries became twisted into occasions for abuse. During Senate meetings, Caligula sometimes ordered senators' wives to perform sexual services while their husbands continued official business. The serious work of governing the empire became tied to acts of degradation, with Rome's most powerful men forced to watch their families dishonored. Religious ceremonies also became corrupted. Caligula claimed he was divine and demanded that rituals include sexual acts in his honor. Priestesses who had taken vows of chastity were forced into public intercourse as part of worship. While traditional religious festivals became excuses for giant orgies with unwilling members of Rome's noble families, the emperor's marriage ceremonies became especially infamous. He married and divorced many times, sometimes within days, using each wedding as a chance to humiliate the bride's family. One account says he forced a bride's father to watch while he consummated the marriage in front of the entire wedding party, turning the sacred act into a public show of conquest. Caligula's desires weren't just about personal pleasure. They became a kind of economic weapon against Rome's rich families. The emperor picked out the most beautiful wives and daughters of wealthy citizens, then demanded sexual access to them in exchange for their family's safety and wealth. This created a twisted marketplace where nobles had to give up their women as payment for survival or favor. Families received invitations for their women to attend private meetings with the emperor, knowing exactly what that meant, but unable to say no without risking everything. Caligula even set up a formal tax system based on sexual service. Rich families were required to send their women to the palace for set periods, with the length and frequency tied to their wealth. This wasn't normal prostitution. It was sexual slavery imposed on Rome's elite, meant to show absolute imperial power. Women who resisted faced brutal punishments. Some were forced into public sexual acts during gladiator games. Others were sold into real prostitution, stripped of their noble status, and made to serve soldiers and slaves. The message was clear: no one was safe from the emperor's reach. The damage to the women caught in Caligula's sexual theater was lasting and devastating. These were women raised under strict Roman morals, taught that their virtue was their most valuable possession and that their duty was to their families and Rome. Suddenly, they were reduced to objects for the emperor's amusement. This clash between their upbringing and their forced humiliation broke many completely. Some women tried to end their own lives rather than give in, but Caligula was ready for this too. Families of women who killed themselves were punished, sometimes with execution, sometimes with financial ruin that destroyed entire bloodlines. This left women trapped between their personal honor and their family's survival, with no choice that didn't lead to disaster. The emperor seemed to enjoy crushing women who resisted at first. He forced them into degrading acts until they submitted fully. Once broken, they were shown off as warnings of what happened to anyone who defied him. Even worse was the way Roman men were made complicit in their family's abuse. Senators and high officials weren't just silent witnesses. They were often forced to help arrange and enable these encounters. Caligula demanded fathers deliver their daughters to his chambers, husbands help prepare their wives, and brothers restrain their sisters during group acts. This forced participation created a deep psychological wound. These men became accomplices in their own family's destruction. The emperor knew that by making men take part in the abuse of their loved ones, he destroyed their honor and dignity. A senator who helped tie down his wife for Caligula's use could never again command respect in the Senate.
His authority was permanently broken. Some men tried to resist by refusing to bring their female relatives to the palace, but Caligula had planned for this too. Families who failed to comply were executed, often in public as warnings. The choice was simple: participate in your family's abuse or watch them die. One of the darkest parts of Caligula's reign was his inclusion of children in palace activities. Ancient sources, though vague, make it clear that his appetites extended to minors, both boys and girls from Rome's most important families. Children brought to palace gatherings were forced to witness acts no child should ever see, creating trauma beyond description.
The trauma left on these children lasted for the rest of their lives. Some were even forced to take part in sexual acts themselves. Their innocence was destroyed as part of the emperor's plan to corrupt every part of Roman society. The long-term damage was devastating. Many grew up unable to form normal relationships. Their ideas about intimacy were forever twisted by what they had seen and experienced in the palace. Others became abusers themselves, continuing the cycle of exploitation when they reached adulthood and positions of power. Caligula seemed to know that by breaking the children of Rome's elite, his corruption would live beyond his own reign. These children would grow into the next generation of Roman leaders. But they carried scars from their childhood in the palace, scars that could spread abuse for decades to come. As his rule went on, Caligula turned his sexual practices into a kind of religious cult built around worship of himself. He declared that he was a living god and demanded that sexual acts in his honor be treated as holy rituals. This wasn't just madness. It was a careful attempt to give his abuse the cover of religion. Temples were built inside the palace where people were required to perform sexual acts as proof of devotion to the divine emperor. These were not voluntary ceremonies. They were forced acts, required of anyone who wanted the emperor's favor or who simply wanted to stay safe from his anger. The emperor created detailed ceremonies around his sexual activities with rules and ritual elements. Sex with the emperor or with his chosen partners became like a form of holy communion. Watching these acts became a kind of worship that was required for palace visitors. This religious mask gave Caligula excuses for even his most extreme demands. When senators' wives were forced into group acts, it was called a sacred duty, not just the emperor's desire. When children were used in rituals, it was described as teaching them holy mysteries instead of what it really was, abuse. Caligula's sexual terror didn't stay inside the palace. It spread across the empire through officials who copied his practices in his name. Governors, generals, and imperial representatives were urged to set up their own versions of the emperor's sexual court, creating an empire-wide system of exploitation. These officials knew that their careers depended on taking part. They competed with each other to invent new ways to humiliate victims, sending reports back to Rome, hoping to impress the emperor with their creativity. The result was an empire where sexual abuse became part of government itself. Ordinary people lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons could be taken by imperial officials for sexual service. This systematic abuse stretched far beyond the palace, affecting millions. Women across the empire lived knowing their bodies were never truly their own. At any moment, they could be claimed by someone with imperial authority. This systematic abuse became one of the defining marks of Caligula's rule, leaving wounds that haunted Roman society for generations. By 40 CE, his excesses had grown so shocking that even those who had seen his earlier horrors were stunned. Palace gatherings turned into sexual shows that lasted for days, with hundreds forced into acts that grew more extreme over time. In his final months, the emperor staged spectacles of unheard-of cruelty. He held massive orgies with senators, their families, foreign guests, slaves, and even animals, creating scenes meant to prove his absolute power over dignity and morality.
These last displays were not just for pleasure. They were messages about power itself. By making Rome's most honored citizens take part in the lowest acts, Caligula was proving that Roman values meant nothing against his will. The breaking point came when he announced plans to make his sexual rituals the official religion of the empire. All Roman citizens would be forced to join sexual ceremonies as proof of loyalty. This threat to turn private abuse into public law was what finally pushed the plot against him into action. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was killed by members of the Praetorian Guard in the underground tunnels of his own palace. But even after his death, his crimes still haunted the victims. The plotters were driven not only by politics, but also by personal pain. Some of the assassins had been forced to watch their own families abused by the emperor. The new emperor, Claudius, faced the heavy task of cleaning up after Caligula's sexual reign of terror. The physical proof of his crimes was everywhere. Rooms built for torture, collections of obscene art showing real victims, and detailed records of encounters that had been used as blackmail against Rome's most powerful families.
The evidence of Caligula's crimes was quietly destroyed, not to honor his memory, but to protect the victims and their families from more shame. Rooms where abuse had happened were sealed or rebuilt, as if the new rulers wanted to erase the memories. The cover-up spread to the history books too. Ancient writers recorded Caligula's sexual crimes, but they used careful coded words that hid just how bad it really was. Many victims and their families preferred it this way, knowing that detailed stories would only bring more humiliation. The saddest part of Caligula's sexual reign was how completely it silenced the victims. Roman society cared deeply about honor and reputation, which made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak out without ruining what was left of their family's standing. Women abused by the emperor faced a culture that would blame them no matter the truth. Men who had been forced to watch their wives degraded couldn't speak about it without admitting their own helplessness and guilt. Children who had seen or suffered abuse carried the pain silently their whole lives. This silence meant the full truth of Caligula's crimes may never be known. Families destroyed by his actions had every reason to hide what had happened. Ancient records were also limited by social rules, since open talk about sex was considered improper in public writing. But the silence also meant victims never found justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering. The new rulers cared more about keeping the empire stable than helping survivors, leaving them to face their trauma alone. The abuse in Caligula's palace had effects far beyond his short 4-year reign. The trauma inflicted on Rome's elite created patterns of damage that lasted for decades. Children who had lived through it grew up with broken views of intimacy, power, and relationships. Some of these children became abusers themselves, unable to tell the difference between healthy relationships and the cruelty they had been taught. Others became victims again, their childhood pain making them easy targets for more exploitation. Families that survived his rule were scarred forever. Marriages ruined by forced encounters never healed. Children raised in fear struggled to form healthy bonds as adults. The very fabric of Roman high society was torn apart by the abuse of its most important families. Perhaps most of all, Caligula's sexual terrorism set patterns for future emperors. Later rulers, while not always as extreme, understood that sexual exploitation was a powerful way to control their enemies and crush opposition. Today, tourists walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, admiring the remains of imperial glory without fully realizing the horrors that once took place there. The marble floors that once shook with screams and sobs now echo with tour guides and lectures on Roman art. But the traces remain for those who look closely. Stones that once held up rooms made for torture, drains that carried away the evidence of assaults, dark tunnels where victims waited in fear to be summoned to the emperor. The ghosts of Caligula's victims still seem to haunt these ruins. The senator's wife who killed herself rather than face another night, the 10-year-old boy who saw his mother tortured, the noble matron forced to serve as a prostitute in the palace brothel. Their stories were erased from history, but their pain still lives in the stones. Caligula's transformation of the palace into a theater of horror lasted less than 4 years, but its echoes shook Roman history and still speak today.
His crimes remind us that sexual abuse has always been a weapon for those who want total control, and that even the most advanced civilizations can be corrupted by one person with no limits. The palace may now be ruins, but its warning remains. Abuse of the powerless by the powerful is not just ancient cruelty, it repeats wherever humans have unchecked authority and use it for evil. The only difference between Caligula's sexual terrorism and modern abuse is the scale and how it's recorded. The forces of power, control, and exploitation remain disturbingly the same across time. In the end, the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy left more than ruined lives in political chaos. He created a model of sexual terror that later tyrants would study and sometimes copy. His legacy was not written in stone or bronze, but in the scars passed down through generations, proof that the worst crimes destroy not only bodies, but souls.